turning your Bibles with me to 2 Samuel 13, and we'll read verses 30 through 39, 30 to the end of chapter 13 of 2 Samuel. And it came to pass, while they were in the way, that tidings came to David, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. Then the king arose and tare his garments, and lay on the earth, and all his servants stood by with their clothes rent. And Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons. For Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom, this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take this thing to his heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead. For Amnon only is dead. But Absalom fled. And the young man that kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said unto the king, Behold, the king's sons come. As thy servant said, so it is. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking, that behold, the king's sons came, and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very sore. But Absalom fled, and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled, and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Beloved, you can easily imagine the scene with which our text begins, or even the scene in the verse before it. A boisterous group of well-dressed men, eating and drinking, talking and laughing, and then a cry, Smite Amnon! A man is surrounded and hacked to pieces. Agonizing groans escape from his lips before his bloodied corpse sprawls on the floor. And for a moment, all the eyes are fixed in horror at this gruesome sight. The conversation is stopped, the food and drink are forgotten, and then comes the sheer blind panic as all the guests run from the table. They're thinking, am I the next to be killed? The festivities turn to flight as the princes mount their mules and gallop south, if mules can gallop, in pure consternation. And there's more consternation and confusion to come. It's going to rain in the palace in Jerusalem as the king hears the news, and his court too. We're going to look this evening at David's grief for Amnon. First, the false report in verses 30 and 31. Second, Jonadab's explanation, verses 32 through 36, and then the next 3 years in the concluding 3 verses. David's grief for Amnon, the false report, Jonadab's explanation, and the next 3 years. Listen to verses 30 and 31 again. And it came to pass, while they were in the way, that is, the princes, as they headed south, that tidings came to David, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. Then the king arose, and tare his garments, and lay on the earth, and all his servants stood by with their clothes rent. Notice, first of all, what this says about the character of Absalom as viewed by his father David. David believes the report that Absalom, his third son, is a murderer, a mass murderer, a fratricidal mass murderer, and that he has just killed all David's sons. Which raises the question, if you heard a report like that one of your sons had just slain all of your other sons, would you believe it? Would you believe it immediately? Would you believe it without asking any questions or raising any objections? And my guess is that I would doubt if you would believe it. I don't think you would believe it. But David's belief of this report about Absalom indicates that Absalom was an especially wicked man whose total depravity manifested itself in a much, much worse form than other totally depraved people. And it indicates to me too that David had seen this in Absalom, whether he liked it or not, whether he wanted to admit it or not. He had seen it. And David knew fine well what Absalom was capable of, so that he immediately received the charge against his third son as true without any questions, as indeed did his whole court, with only one exception. This reminds me of another scene in the life of Absalom and David over 3 years later. 2 Samuel 15 verses 13 and 14. And there came a messenger to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom." That is, the whole nation in large part has revolted against you and are following Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword." He immediately believed that report too, that his son had revolted against him, and if he didn't leave the city, he and his entire court would be massacred. That was the testimony of Absalom's own father, because he knew his son. That's some report. And notice second here, the damage that may be done by an imprecise and false report. Listen to the tidings that came to David. Absalom has slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. And David, immediately on hearing that report, thinks of the sons born to him in Hebron, according to 2 Samuel 3. There's Amnon, the son of Ahinamam the Jezreelite, gone. Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, slain. Absalom, the third son, well, he's the mass murderer. Adonijah, the son of Haggith, dead. Shephatiah, the son of Abital, killed. Ithream by Eglah, gone too. And what about the other sons that were born to David in Jerusalem? Were they old enough to have gone to that sheep shearing celebration in Baal Hazor? Or did they go with their mothers or with their servants? And their names are given in 2 Samuel 5. Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon. Was Solomon there? Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, Eliphalet. Has he lost some dozen or so sons all in one day. Whereupon David would have thought to himself, what about the promise? The promise of God that I would have seed upon my throne. Because if they're all wiped out, if they all were there, and Absalom's the only one left, and he's a fratricidal maniac, where do we all stand? What about the covenant line? What about the coming Messiah? What about the faithfulness and mercy of God? And you'll notice again how emphatic the report is. Absalom has slain all the king's sons. And in case you missed it, and there is not one of them left. And even then, though, because of the seriousness of the issue, you would have thought that David would have probed, asked questions, asked for proof. You can easily imagine if someone told you that all your family had been wiped out in a car accident or a plane crash. And how would you feel if it turned out that it had only been one of them? Bad as that is. What do you make of these claims? So-and-so, who's a member in good standing in the church, doesn't believe any of the Reformed doctrines. And it turns out that the person in question asked the question about the Reformed doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Just asked the question. Well, what does this mean? I don't understand all that. But then it goes about that he doesn't believe a single doctrine in the Reformed faith. Well, he asked the question. None of the office bearers in the church are any good. They're all useless. Well, all of them are useless. Not one of them is any good. Is it simply a matter of maybe some weaknesses? Or are they all absolutely useless? Because you need to be clear on such things. You need to get it right. Or one of my favourite stories, a married member of the church, didn't happen here, married member of the church has been spotted hugging a woman in a restaurant on the north coast. He's just committed adultery. But it turns out that it was his sister whose husband had recently died and she needed some consolation. Or here's one, nobody in the church likes me. Seriously? Absolutely no one? There's not a single person? They're all against you? Maybe you mean, instead of everybody dislikes, maybe you mean most people, or many people, or some people, or a few people. Or maybe you really mean, well, there's one person who doesn't like me. And then, even if that's true, how much do they dislike you? You don't just say, everybody dislikes me. And if, for instance, you do know that you've done something against that person, well then, wisdom would say, go and talk with the person. Discuss it. There may be a way of solving this problem. And maybe if you talk to the person who you think has been snubbing you, you may find out that there's nothing behind it whatsoever. Whereas you were all annoyed that nobody in the church liked you, that everybody was against you. Really? Everybody? Such an incident as this is one more example to us that, especially as Christians, and particularly when we're dealing with big issues like this that can have effect on your own life or somebody else's life, that you need to get your facts straight, and you need to take some time and effort in order to find out the truth. And if after that you're still not sure and you feel that you ought to say something to the matter at hand, you could say, well, I have heard that, but I can't vouch for it personally. It seems that, or this is the way it would appear, or I think that this might be the case, But I'd have to look into it more fully. Here's the 9th commandment, according to Lord's Day 43. Thou shalt not bear false witness means that I bear false witness against no man, nor falsify any man's words, that I be no backbiter nor slanderer, that I do not judge nor join in condemning any man rashly or unheard, but that I avoid all sorts of lies and deceit as the proper works of the devil, unless I would bring down upon me the heavy wrath of God. Likewise, that in judgment and all other dealings I love the truth, speak it uprightly and confess it, also that I defend and promote as much as I am able the honour and good character of my neighbour. Now, Absalom here is a wicked wretch, and we can say that too without breaking the 9th commandment, because it's absolutely true and there's a good reason for saying it. But for all that, he did not murder all his brothers. And though it's hard to find words bad enough for Absalom, there's no need for anybody to misrepresent him as if he'd killed all the king's sons. Bad as he is, you don't need to make up or garble reports to make him even worse than he is. He's bad enough already. And you need to beware in general, though not in every instance, of statements like everybody, or nobody. And if the witnesses here had been more wary and got their facts straight and taken a bit of time to ask people and find out what really happened instead of running ahead of the crowd, it would have saved David and his whole court a lot of grief. Notice thirdly that David's grief here was appropriate, given that he has accepted the report, though it was largely false. His grief is appropriate. He is, after all, a believer, a godly man, for all his faults, although David would put, no doubt, all of us to shame. And he loved his sons and his kingdom, though there is a certain amount of inordinate affection involved too. David's grief is that one of his sons is a murderer, that he has a Cain in his own family. He's thinking to himself, my other sons have been murdered by him. At least Cain only killed one of his brothers. And he's thinking too of the poor mothers and sisters of the murdered princes. He's grieving also because he's thinking about God's promise to me, God's promise about the coming Messiah and the salvation of Israel, and indeed the world, the ends of the earth. And so it's no wonder that the king, David, is the chief mourner. Then, says verse 31, the king arose, presumably he was sitting on his throne, and tare his garments. They did that quite a lot in the Old Testament. And lay on the earth. And the court joined in, such that all his servants stood by with their clothes rent. They didn't lie on the floor like David, but they too were grieving. But then comes Jonadab's explanation. And the first question is, what's he doing there? Jonadab, what's he doing? Still in David's court? We touched on this in an earlier sermon. Remember Jonadab's sins. He pimped for Amnon. He led Amnon to dupe David. He facilitated Amnon's incestuous rape of Tamar. And yet, he's still in David's court. What about his sins? What about his crimes? What about Psalm 101 that David wrote about how he was going to lead his household and preserve the city of God in holiness? Jonadab's still there. He would have been kicked out of some of the politically correct courts of our day. But he's still there with David. Disgusting. Then there's this question. How did Jonadab know? How did Jonadab know? Nobody else in the court seemed to know. How did he know that Absalom had only slain Amnon and not the other brothers of Amnon? And here there are various proposals. Some people say that Jonadab must have overheard Absalom's plan, but apparently nobody else did. And if he had overheard, wouldn't he have warned David and his sons? Wretch that he is, I think there's a fair chance that he would have. Evidently, David and his court did not suspect this to be the source of Jonadab's explanation, because they didn't probe him with any questions. And I, for one, think that Absalom, who was able to keep his rebellion quiet, which is an awful lot more difficult, was the sort of man who could keep his mouth shut for 2 years so that nobody did know. I don't believe that Jonadab knew beforehand. Other people say, though they are only a few, that Jonadab was actually in league with Absalom right from the start. And when I say right from the start, I mean right from the start. That is, Absalom and Jonadab wanted Amnon to rape Tamar, to give Absalom an excuse to kill Amnon. And so Jonadab, with Absalom's encouragement, set up the scene for the rape. So that Absalom and Jonadab then could plan Absalom's murder of Amnon. I don't know about you, but I find that very far-fetched. Wicked as Jonadab was, especially the first point, would Absalom really want Amnon to rape his sister? To give him a chance to kill Amnon? I believe there's a much simpler explanation how Jonadab knew that Absalom had only killed one son, Amnon. And I think I can show this to you. Think about what we know from Jonadab from previous sermons. Jonadab knew the character of Amnon, the character of David, the character of Tamar when he set up that scene to get Tamar into Amnon's bedroom. He knew that Amnon, there was something wrong with him, so he asked the right question. He knew that if Amnon went to David, David would send Tamar, and he knew that Tamar, kind-hearted girl that she was, would bring the cakes. Well, Jonadab not only knew the character of David, Amnon, and Tamar, he knew the character of Absalom. And Jonadab knew the character of Absalom for the reason that he was very cunning and crafty. And even David knew. When he heard that Absalom has killed the sons, he thought to himself, he's well and able to do it. Yes, well, Jonadab had that worked out himself. Now add this element. According to 2 Samuel 13, verse 22, Absalom spoke neither good nor bad to Amnon. Think of it from Jonadab's perspective. Jonadab knows the kind of Absalom, that he's hateful, vengeful, and murderous. Then he watches Absalom never say good or evil to Amnon for 2 years. And he understands, whereas other people didn't twig, that the only reason why he's doing that is that he's biding his time to kill him when the time is right. And now when this report comes in that Absalom has killed all the brothers, Jonadab joins up the dots correctly. He says, now, why would Absalom kill them all? What would be the point in that? No, he has been biding his time to kill Amnon. His problem's with Amnon. And therefore the report, it sounds somewhat garbled to me anyway, these men have brought this down from Baal Hazor. No, I think the report's wrong. Verses 32 and 33. Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered and said, "Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom, this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore, let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead. For Amnon only is dead." He showed more intuition, more understanding of the character of Absalom than even Absalom's father. And then come the subsequent events in 3 stages. First of all, the lookout sees many people coming from the north, but he can't make out distinctive features. Just a lot of people coming from the north. Time passes. The group of people comes within vision. Jonadab can detect, there are people on mules. He knows the steeds of the king's sons. They're wearing fair clothes. I can recognize faces. Scared, despondent, grieving faces. Verse 35. And Jonadab said unto the king, "Behold, the king's sons come, as thy servant said, so it is." Never one to miss an opportunity to praise his own craftiness. He comes out with what we would say, "I told you so, told you, I had it worked out, bow down, admit that I'm the only one with any wisdom or brains in the whole court." And then the lookout, Jonadab, and then thirdly, Kileab, Adonijah, Shephatiah, and all the other sons enter the palace. Cue weeping. All 3 parties now weep profusely. The princes weep loudly. They've just seen one brother brutally murder another brother in cold blood. And they thought that for a moment they were going to get it too. They're in shock, somewhat traumatized, no doubt. David, he weeps very sore as well. He sees the weeping of his sons. That doesn't leave him untouched. They're weeping for the loss of Amnon. He realizes that the violence of rape has now led to the violence of murder. He's bitter over his son Absalom, and he's also weeping in the midst of all these conflicting and terrible emotions out of relief that most of his sons are still living, that they're back with him. He thought for a moment that he would never see them again. And so the text says that all David's servants wept very sore too. David's weeping, the princes are weeping. Generally, when one person weeps, it sets everybody else off. But here we have a huge tragedy that has befallen the palace and the nation. The Bible has any number of famous weepings. Peter went out and wept. The weeping over Jacob in Genesis 50 verse 11 was even given a name. Abel Mitzrayim, the weeping of Egypt. The family had come out of Egypt, and the Egyptians looked on and said, "Wow, this is some weeping." We sang this morning Psalm 84 verse 6, which talks about the valley of Baca, the valley of tears. Well, here there's a terrible weeping, but there's no particular name ascribed to it. The king, the princes, the servants, these men are crying. But what about Absalom? Well, Absalom also fled from that sheep shearing party in Baal Hazor, only he went not south, like his surviving brethren who returned to Jerusalem. He went north and west. And he went north and west, knowing full well that once he'd dispatched his brother, that was his destination, because north and west took him to Talmai, the king of Geshur. And if you ask, well, why did he go to Talmai, the king of Geshur? The answer is that Talmai was his grandfather. Talmai was his mother's father. And that's where Absalom stayed for the next 3 years. Absalom went there in the confidence that Talmai would protect him. Absalom was his grandson. Absalom had just avenged the rape of Talmai's granddaughter. And now Talmai had no time for David, since David had failed to punish the rapist of Talmai's daughter's daughter, called Tamar. And now there's more grief for David. He's had a daughter raped. His number one son has been murdered for that incestuous rape. His number 3 son has become a murderer, and now he has tension with one of his father-in-laws. It's getting worse, not better. And now it's all coming back to haunt David. It seems to David, no doubt at this time, that he's having to pay for all of the sins of his life. Not pay to satisfy them, but pay in the sense that God is chastising him for his iniquities. Let's move back a couple of years or so. The great sin and the great turning point in David's life was Bathsheba and then Uriah. Because David not only broke the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery with Bathsheba, but also the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill, with Uriah. So here's the 7th commandment, and David can see the parallels, just as you can see the parallels. The 7th commandment broken by David with Bathsheba, a beautiful woman. Then his number one son, Amnon, breaks the 7th commandment with Tamar, David's beautiful daughter. 2 years later, David sees his other great sin replicated in another son. Thou shalt not kill. David killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, and now his 3rd son, Absalom, kills Amnon, his sister's rapist. And he could see the parallels. God is doing this to me because I did this against him. He sees this and he feels it, and it haunts him. And over the next 3 years, David would have had a lot of time to run the events at Baal Hazor through his mind. And he doubtless did. And he could see parallels there too. Wasn't it despicable that Absalom made this big meal for Amnon and pretended that Amnon was such a wonderful guest and he was glad to be the host? But I, David, had made a big meal for Uriah. Well, wasn't it a scummy thing that Absalom did to get Amnon tipsy, feeding him wine? but I got Uriah drunk. And Absalom had his servants kill Amnon. He wouldn't even do it himself. But I had Joab use the swords of the Ammonites to kill Uriah. And then David could have thought, I'm pretty confident he did think, that there's this point too. Amnon, whom David killed, in one sense deserved death. He deserved death, and David was the one who should have had him executed for rape and incest. Amnon at least deserved death. But Uriah, whom I killed, was wholly innocent. And Uriah was one of the best soldiers I ever had in my army. And my sin was, at least in that regard, even worse. And after this latest misery, David surely travelled back with a view to his sins even further this time. Back beyond his iniquities with Bathsheba and Uriah to his other sins against the seventh commandment. And where did David's sins against the seventh commandment begin? Polygamy. 2 Samuel 3, we've referred to it already in this sermon, mentions 6 wives that David had. From your knowledge of the life of David, you'll recall another wife, Michal. So that makes 7. And this is 2 Samuel 5, verse 13. Once David leaves Hebron, he comes to Jerusalem, and David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come to Hebron. And there were yet sons and daughters born to David. So 7 so far. Bathsheba was another one. And then he has other wives, plural, and other concubines, plural. So does David have 15 wives or concubines? Or 20? Or 25? Or 30? Hard to say. No one knows. Genesis 2 makes it very clear that God's purpose right from the beginning was one man for one woman for life. Adam and Eve were the model for the whole human race. That's in Genesis 2. Have you ever read it, David? He had. He meditated in God's law day and night. And as he read the scriptures, David knew that polygamy always meant trouble. Abraham had a wife and a concubine, Sarah and Hagar. And then later on he married another woman after Sarah died, but a wife and a concubine, and that brought him an awful lot of grief. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and there was an awful lot more family trouble for him. Isaac, in this regard, only had 1 wife, and he still had trouble, but not as much. Elimelech, 2 women. They didn't get on well either. And I've mentioned examples which were earlier in biblical history that David would have known. But David is engaging in polygamy. But it was part of the accepted thing in those days and in that time, in that place, that kings and rulers have more than 1 wife. Well, that's true, but it doesn't mean it's right. And then David goes from polygamy to lots of polygamy. He didn't just have 2 wives or concubines like Abraham or Elimelech, or 4 like Jacob. He had many. And there's an additional stipulation regarding kings in Deuteronomy 17, verse 17. Neither shall he that is, the king whom Moses foresees by God's inspiration, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Remember the law, David, that says about the king that the king mustn't multiply wives. And you're the first godly king we've had. Saul was an unbeliever. You're the man after God's own heart. And now you commit not only polygamy, but lots of polygamy. And then it gets worse. David, amongst his many wives and concubines, married at least one pagan woman. 2 Samuel 3 verse 3 calls her Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And our text, verse 37, mentions that Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. Our text brings this up. It's inviting you. Go back and look at chapter 3 verse 3. Find out who Absalom's mother is. The only wife of David that we know for sure was a pagan, this one, Maacah. And it's this son, born of the pagan woman, contrary to God's covenant, which says you mustn't marry outside of Israel. No pagan wives. It's this son who gives him the most trouble. At the time, you see, David thought this was great wisdom to marry Maacah, because marrying her would forge a helpful political alliance with the king of Geshur. And sure, all the kings do it. All the kings in the ancient Middle East did it. The kings in Europe did it historically too. It was a way of protecting your border. You marry someone from a royal family to forge ties so you have an ally when you're next attacked. And David thought, well, this is just good politics. And then he thought, into the bargain, she's also an extremely attractive girl. And she was extremely attractive, judging by the fact that her son, Absalom, was the most handsome man in the Bible, and her daughter, Tamar, was so attractive that even her half-brother lusted for her and became lust-sick. So she, evidently, was a very beautiful woman too. So David thought, well, we've this wonderful political alliance and this gorgeous new wife. Oh, what could be better? But he was deceived. Deceived. It was sin for David to do it. And even though he married her, and there didn't seem to be any big problem, but it caught up on him at the end, and he felt the sting of that sin years later. And it was a terrible sin. Sting. As well as a terrible sin. So you see David here and his dissent regarding the seventh commandment. Polygamy. Lots of polygamy, contrary to Deuteronomy 17, verse 17. Then he marries an unbeliever. And then, because he's already been going worse and worse into sin regarding the seventh commandment, then he commits adultery with Bathsheba. And then the dam, as it were, of God's chastening wrath breaks, and the blows rain down upon David's head year after year until his death. And that's especially why we read 2 Samuel 12 earlier. Verse 10. Because of your sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, now therefore the sword. And with this lesson, we do have the sword. That was probably the means of death for Amnon. The sword shall never depart from thy house. It'll be with you every year till you die. The sword. It won't depart from your house, the worst place to have a sword in your own family, because you've despised me. That's what you did with breaking the 7th and 6th commandments. You despised me. Verse 11 continues, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom. And we're not going to read the second half of verse 11 and the rest of verse 12, because they haven't really been fulfilled yet, but they're coming. They're coming. It's going to get worse. There is more agony for David to come. And thus we have David's grief. Verse 37 says, David mourned for his son every day. And the first time you read that, you think to yourself, I wonder which son it means. Amnon? Absalom? And then you say, no, it means Amnon. He mourned for his son Amnon every day. His firstborn son, the firstborn of his strength, murdered every day. Every day for up to 3 years. 1,000 days. Presumably it gets a little bit easier each day. Then verse 39, we read at the end that David was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Eventually, consolation returned, and he said, It's finished. I can cope with that now. And the rest of verse 39 says, And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. The soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom. You don't mean David, really? You want to be close to him again? So far in our series on Absalom and his rebellion, we have seen a lot of inordinate affection. God's word commends affection, love, but there's inordinate affection. That is, an affection which isn't ordered by the Scriptures. Inordinate. There was Amnon's lust for Tamar. That's not love, that's an inordinate affection. There was Absalom's hatred of Amnon for his raping Tamar. He loved Tamar. No. His regard for Tamar was such that he then took vengeance, which was sinful, and so he too shows inordinate affection. A love or care for someone that isn't in keeping with the truth of God and His Word. And then there's David's inordinate affection. Too soft on Amnon, letting Amnon off after the rape. And now we see David's inordinate affection for Absalom. Because we're told that the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom. 2 Samuel 13 verse 39. Absalom was a murderer. But David's inordinate affection shows that with the passing of time, justice falls into abeyance. Well, a few years have passed. We'll let him off with it. And if you're asking what the lesson is from all of this, it could be summed up in one word. It's a warning. It's a warning of what can happen in the family of the believer if he gives in to sin, especially gross and presumptuous sin. It happened even to so godly a man as David, and so it can happen to us too. And this passage also teaches us, as does the entire Absalom narrative, the need to learn from one's mistakes. And if you see something like this storyline working out in your own life and family, well, maybe it'll help you understand the source. What's happening? This sort of thing drives us back to the cross of Jesus Christ, where we receive the forgiveness of sins and cleansing and peace with God, and then enables us to submit to the chastening hand of the Lord and to try as best we can, because there's always hope, to rectify the things that yet remain within our power by God's grace. And of course, the warning aspect of all this is that we should not fall into these sorts of sins. Here's the misery. Here's the grief. Don't start down that line. And if you're here tonight and you're thinking, all of this sounds very depressing. Well, sin is depressing, especially the outworking of sin, the effects of sin, the misery it brings through generations. And if you say, well, maybe that's the minister's fault, maybe he's a sort of a depressing guy, well, that's this scripture. If we were preaching tonight on the last 2 chapters of Revelation and the glory of the new heavens and the new earth, it would be a different message. The sermons we had recently on the 7 words of Christ from the cross, that has a different flavour, but the idea of this text, and indeed this series, you have been warned, it's the text which dictates and determines the mood and the lessons. And you should also realize that we've only had 3 weeks of this series. And spare a thought for poor David, who had this personally happening in his family. You're only hearing about it for a sermon of about 45 minutes. David had this with the rape of one of his sons on one of his daughters. That was grief enough. Then 3 years later, there's another flare-up where one of his sons murders another one of his sons, and it is not over by a long chalk. In fact, it's only just starting. And let us commend our ways to God and ask for His rich mercy upon us, that we may be faithful and obey the word and not need so many or so severe chastisements. Amen.